The morning mist clung to the scarred landscape of the St. Mihiel, salient like a shroud over the dead. For 4 years, this triangular bulge in the Allied lines had festered like an infected wound, jutting 25 miles deep into French territory. General John Joseph Pershing stood at his command post, studying the topographical maps that told the story of American ambition, written in contour lines and elevation marks. The date was September 11, 1918, and tomorrow would mark the baptism of fire for the United States First Army. The salient had been German territory since 1914, when Crown Prince Ruprecht of Bavaria's forces swept through this sector during their initial advance toward Paris. What began as a tactical position had become a strategic nightmare for the Allies. From these elevated positions, German artillery could interdict the vital Paris-Nancy railway, strangling French supply lines and reinforcing the deadlock that had characterized the Western Front for years. Pershing adjusted his wire-rimmed spectacles and traced the battle lines with his finger. The American expeditionary forces had arrived in France as green troops untested in the mechanized slaughter that defined modern warfare. But 18 months of brutal education in the trenches of Below Wood, Château-Thierry, and the Marne had forged them into something harder. Now, 550,000 American soldiers prepared to prove that the New World could break the Old World's stalemate. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. 2 American corps would strike the salient from opposite sides. The First Corps is under General Hunter Liggett, attacking from the south, while the Fourth Corps is commanded by General Joseph Theodore Dickman drove from the northwest. French forces, including the Second Colonial Corps, would hammer the apex of the salient directly. The goal was nothing less than the complete elimination of the German position in a coordinated pincer movement. According to historical records from the U.S. Army Center of Military History, the operation would involve 7 divisions and represent the largest offensive ever undertaken by United States Armed Forces to that date. Lieutenant Colonel George Catlett Marshall, serving as Pershing's chief of operations, had spent sleepless nights coordinating the movement of men and materiel across the French countryside. The logistics alone were staggering: 419 tanks, over 1,000 aircraft, and artillery pieces stretching as far as the eye could see. Brigadier General Douglas MacArthur, commanding the 42nd Rainbow Division, paced restlessly in his sector, his uniform immaculate despite the muddy conditions. The Rainbow Division earned its colorful nickname from its composition National Guard units drawn from across America, representing every state in a patchwork of regional pride and national purpose. MacArthur had already proven himself in previous engagements, displaying the aggressive leadership style that would define his military career. The German defenders under the command of General Georg Fuchs were not idle. Intelligence reports suggested they were preparing to withdraw from the salient, recognizing its strategic vulnerability in light of recent Allied successes. The race was on wood. The Americans catch the Germans in position for a decisive battle, or would they find nothing but empty trenches and abandoned positions? As night fell on September 11th, the artillery batteries began their preliminary bombardment. The thunder of guns rolled across the countryside like an approaching storm, visible flashes illuminating the horizon in hellish relief. American gunners, many of whom had learned their craft from French instructors just months earlier, worked with methodical precision to suppress German positions and cut wire obstacles. In the trenches, doughboys checked their rifles and fixed bayonets. These were no longer the enthusiastic volunteers who had marched through New York's ticker tape parades in 1917. Combat had stripped away their illusions and replaced them with grim competence. They knew that tomorrow would test not just their courage, but America's commitment to the Allied cause. The St. Mihiel salient loomed before them in the darkness, its German positions marked by the occasional flare or machine gun burst. For years of stalemate had created this moment America's first independent offensive of the Great War. By dawn, they would discover whether the citizen soldiers of democracy could succeed where European armies had failed. At precisely 1 o'clock in the morning on September 12, 1918, the earth erupted in fire and thunder. 3,000 American and French artillery pieces opened simultaneous fire along the St. Mihiel front, transforming the pre-dawn darkness into a hellscape of orange flashes and screaming metal. The preliminary bombardment, orchestrated with mathematical precision by Lieutenant Colonel Marshall's staff, was designed to obliterate German positions and clear paths through the wire obstacles that had stymied previous Allied assaults. German soldiers huddled in their concrete bunkers and reinforced trenches as high explosive shells pulverized the ground above them. The bombardment was unlike anything they had experienced in this relatively quiet sector. For months, St. Mihiel had been considered a backwater posting, a place where war-weary veterans could recover from the horrific battles of Verdun and the Somme. Now, as American shells rained down with industrial intensity, they realized their respite was over. General Pershing established his advanced command post near Ligny and Boris. It's close enough to the action to maintain direct communication with his corps' commanders, but sufficiently removed to preserve the strategic perspective necessary for Army-level command. Radio communications in 1918 remained primitive and unreliable, forcing Pershing to depend on motorcycle couriers and telephone lines that were constantly severed by artillery fire. The French Second Colonial Corps, composed of battle-hardened veterans from Senegal and Morocco, prepared to assault the tip of the salient near the town of St. Mihiel itself. These colonial troops had earned fearsome reputations in previous engagements, combining European military discipline with indigenous fighting traditions. Their commander, General Henry Matthias Berthelot, had specifically requested the honor of leading the assault on the salient's apex, recognizing the symbolic importance of French forces recapturing this lost territory. As the bombardment reached its crescendo at 5:30 in the morning, American officers synchronized their watches and prepared to launch the infantry assault. The timing was critical too early, and their own artillery would slaughter advancing troops. Too late, and the Germans would have time to recover from the bombardment and man their defensive positions. The first waves went over the top at exactly 5:45. As the artillery barrage lifted and began rolling forward in a carefully choreographed creeping barrage, soldiers of the First Corps emerged from their trenches and advanced across no man's land. With rifle-fixed bayonets gleaming in the morning light, the methodical advance that characterized American tactics reflected months of training under French tutelage, emphasizing fire and movement over the suicidal frontal assaults that had characterized early war tactics. Brigadier General MacArthur led the Rainbow Division's advance personally, refusing to remain in the relative safety of a command bunker. His theatrical leadership style, he habitually carried a riding crop instead of a weapon and wore a non-regulation uniform made him instantly recognizable to his troops. As they advanced through the shattered German positions, MacArthur's presence boosted morale and demonstrated the aggressive leadership philosophy that Pershing demanded from his officers. The German response was surprisingly weak. Instead of the coordinated defensive fire that had stopped previous Allied offensives, American troops encountered scattered resistance from demoralized garrison units. Intelligence officers soon realized that General Fuchs had indeed begun withdrawing his best troops to more defensible positions, leaving behind a skeleton force to delay the American advance. This tactical withdrawal, while strategically sound from the German perspective, proved catastrophic for the troops left behind. Cut off from retreat routes by the speed of the American advance, entire German units found themselves surrounded and forced to surrender. By mid-morning, American soldiers were capturing prisoners by the hundreds of young German conscripts who seemed relieved to be out of the war. The early success exceeded Pershing's most optimistic projections. His careful preparation, combined with German tactical errors, was producing the kind of breakthrough that had eluded Allied commanders for 4 years. As reports flooded into his command post, Pershing began to realize that the St. Mihiel operation might accomplish its objectives ahead of schedule, freeing American forces for the even larger offensive planned for the Meuse-Argonne sector. But victory in battle was never simply a matter of initial success. The real test would come as German reserves counterattacked and American forces attempted to consolidate their gains against inevitable enemy resistance. By noon on September 12th, the character of the battle had transformed from methodical assault to rapid exploitation. American forces, having punched through the German defensive line with surprising ease, found themselves racing across open ground toward objectives they had expected to reach only after days of costly fighting. The rigid trench warfare that had defined the Western Front for 4 years was giving way to something resembling mobile warfare development that caught both sides unprepared. General Legate's First Corps advanced steadily from the south, their progress measured not in yards but in miles. The 26th Yankee Division, composed primarily of New England National Guard units, captured the village of Seekepri by 10 o'clock, finding it virtually abandoned except for a handful of German engineers attempting to destroy bridges and railway infrastructure. These Yankee soldiers, many of whom had worked in the textile mills and shipyards of Massachusetts before the war, demonstrated the adaptability that characterized American forces throughout the conflict. The speed of the advance created unexpected challenges. American supply lines, designed to support a methodical battle of attrition, struggled to keep pace with units that were advancing several miles per day. Ammunition wagons and field kitchens, pulled by horses and mules that were increasingly anachronistic on the mechanized battlefield, lagged behind the infantry. Soldiers found themselves carrying extra ammunition and rations, transforming each man into a mobile supply depot. Communication proved equally problematic. Telephone lines laid during the night were severed by German artillery, and the primitive radio equipment available to American forces in 1918 had limited range and reliability. Officers resorted to signal flags, messenger pigeons, and motorcycle couriers to maintain contact with higher headquarters, creating delays that could prove fatal in rapidly developing tactical situations. General Dickman's 4th Corps, attacking from the northwest, encountered stiffer resistance near Theocourt. German machine gun nests, positioned in the ruins of destroyed villages, inflicted significant casualties on advancing American units before being overwhelmed by superior numbers. The 1st Division, known as the Big Red One for its distinctive shoulder patch, demonstrated the aggressive tactics that had earned them recognition as one of America's premier combat formations. The battle's aerial component was equally dramatic. American pilots flying French-built aircraft under the overall command of Brigadier General William "Billy" Mitchell achieved air superiority over the battlefield through sheer numerical advantage rather than technical sophistication. Mitchell had assembled over 1,000 aircraft for the operation, creating the largest concentration of air power in military history to that date. German pilots, outnumbered and flying obsolete aircraft, could do little more than conduct occasional harassment raids against American ground forces. French colonial troops, meanwhile, achieved their objective with characteristic efficiency. The 2nd Colonial Corps entered the town of St. Mihiel on September 15th, capturing 4,000 German prisoners in the process. These seasoned veterans, many of whom had served in France's colonial campaigns in Africa before the war, brought tropical warfare experience to European battlefields, demonstrating tactics that European armies had not yet mastered. The psychological impact of the American success was as significant as its tactical achievements. For 4 years, the Western Front had been characterized by minimal territorial changes achieved at enormous cost. Battles like Verdun and the Somme had consumed hundreds of thousands of lives for gains measured in hundreds of yards. The St. Mihiel offensive demonstrated that properly planned and executed operations could still achieve decisive results. German morale, already strained by 4 years of war and the failure of their spring offensive, suffered another severe blow. Reports from captured prisoners indicated widespread demoralization among German units, with many soldiers expressing relief at being removed from combat. The German High Command began to realize that American forces represented more than just additional Allied manpower. They brought fresh tactical approaches and industrial capacity that could tip the strategic balance. By evening on September 12th, American forces had advanced further in one day than most Allied offensives had achieved in months. The success was intoxicating, but experienced commanders like Pershing understood that initial victories meant nothing without sustained exploitation. The real test would come in the following days. As German reserves arrived and the Americans attempted to consolidate their gains, dawn on September 13th revealed the magnitude of American success. German positions that had anchored their defensive line for 4 years lay in Allied hands. The carefully constructed salient was collapsing like a house of cards. General Pershing's pincer movement was working exactly as planned, with American forces from north and south converging on the town of Vignes, threatening to encircle thousands of German defenders still attempting to retreat from their forward positions. The race for Vignes became the focal point of the day's action. This small French village, unremarkable except for its strategic position astride the main German supply route, represented the key to completely severing enemy communications within the salient. Whoever controlled Vignes would determine whether the retreating Germans escaped to fight another day, or found themselves trapped in an enormous prisoner-of-war cage. Colonel George Smith Patton, Jr., commanding the 304th Tank Brigade, led the American mechanized spearhead toward Vigneulles with characteristic aggression. Patton's tanks, a mixture of French-built Renault light tanks and heavier British models, represented the cutting edge of military technology. Though primitive by later standards, these armored vehicles provided mobile firepower and psychological intimidation that proved decisive in exploiting breakthrough situations. The tank advance was not without its challenges. Mechanical reliability remained problematic, with nearly a quarter of Patton's armored vehicles breaking down due to engine failure, thrown tracks, or fuel shortages. Tank crews hastily trained in the complexities of armored warfare struggled with vehicles that required constant maintenance and specialized technical knowledge. Yet those tanks that remained operational proved devastatingly effective against German positions designed to stop infantry assaults rather than armored attacks. German resistance stiffened as the strategic implications of the American advance became apparent. Reserve units rushed forward from positions deeper in France, established hasty defensive lines designed to keep escape routes open long enough for the main force to withdraw. Machine gun positions, hastily dug and camouflaged, exacted a toll on advancing American infantry, who had grown accustomed to the surprisingly light resistance of the previous day. The human cost of rapid advance became apparent as casualty reports reached Corps' headquarters. While American losses remained light compared to typical Western Front standards, the speed of operations meant that wounded soldiers often had to wait hours for medical attention. Field hospitals, positioned for a methodical battle, found themselves miles behind the advancing troops. Medical personnel improvised evacuation procedures, using captured German ambulances and even farm carts to transport casualties to aid stations. Weather conditions complicated the advance. September rain turned unpaved French roads into muddy quagmires that bogged down supply wagons and slowed the movement of reserves. American logistics officers, trained in the relatively efficient infrastructure of the United States, discovered that French rural roads were inadequate for supporting large-scale military operations. Engineers worked around the clock to improve transportation routes, but their efforts could not keep pace with the advancing infantry. As referenced in U.S. Army historical documentation, communication between advancing units and higher headquarters remained sporadic throughout the day. Field telephone lines laid hastily during the advance were frequently severed by German artillery or simply failed due to poor installation. Radio communication, while more reliable than telephone networks, remained limited by the primitive equipment available to American forces. The convergence on Vigneulles accelerated during the afternoon, as American units from both directions of attack made contact with each other. Elements of the 1st Corps, advancing from the south, met patrols from the 4th Corps advancing from the northwest at approximately 4:30 in the afternoon. The meeting was symbolic rather than tactically significant. German forces had already abandoned most positions within the salient, but it represented the successful completion of Pershing's pincer movement. By evening, American forces controlled virtually the entire St. Mihiel salient. German resistance had collapsed with surprising speed, leaving behind thousands of prisoners, hundreds of artillery pieces, and enormous quantities of military supplies. The success exceeded even Pershing's optimistic projections, demonstrating that American forces had matured from the green troops who had arrived in France 18 months earlier into a formidable fighting force capable of conducting complex military operations. September 14th dawned with the peculiar quiet that follows great battles. The thunder of artillery had diminished to sporadic exchanges as German forces completed their withdrawal from the shattered salient, leaving behind a landscape transformed by 4 years of fortification and 4 days of intense combat. American soldiers, many experiencing their first major victory, moved through abandoned German positions with a mixture of pride and soberness that comes with witnessing war's destructive power. The extent of American success became apparent as intelligence officers compiled their preliminary assessments. Over 16,000 German prisoners had been captured, along with 450 artillery pieces and enormous quantities of military equipment. These numbers represented more than tactical success. They demonstrated that American forces had achieved the kind of decisive breakthrough that had eluded Allied armies throughout the war's static phase. General MacArthur's Rainbow Division had particularly distinguished itself during the final phase of operations. His aggressive leadership, which included personally leading reconnaissance patrols behind German lines, had inspired his men to achievements that exceeded their training and experience. The Rainbow Division's successful assault on heavily fortified positions near Esse demonstrated that American National Guard units, properly led and equipped, could match the performance of regular Army formations. The human cost of victory, while remarkably light by Western Front standards, still represented individual tragedies multiplied across hundreds of families. American casualties totaled approximately 7,000 killed, wounded, and missing, a fraction of the losses typically associated with major offensives. Each casualty report that reached Pershing's headquarters represented a son, husband, or father who would not return home, tempering the celebration of tactical success with awareness of war's ultimate price. Medical personnel worked tirelessly to evacuate wounded soldiers from forward positions to established hospitals. The Army Medical Corps, which had struggled with the rapid pace of advance, gradually restored efficient evacuation procedures as the front line stabilized. Field hospitals hastily moved forward to support advancing troops, provided immediate surgical care that saved hundreds of lives. Nurse volunteers, many of whom had crossed the Atlantic specifically to serve American forces, demonstrated courage under fire that equaled that of combat soldiers. French civilians, liberated after 4 years of German occupation, greeted American soldiers with celebrations that revealed the emotional impact of prolonged military occupation. Villages like St. Mihiel itself, which had endured years of German administration, displayed French flags that had been hidden since 1914. The joy of liberation was tempered by the devastation visible everywhere: destroyed buildings, ruined farms, and infrastructure systematically demolished by retreating German forces. The strategic implications of American success extended far beyond the St. Mihiel sector. German high command, already concerned about deteriorating conditions on multiple fronts, recognized that American forces represented a new factor in the strategic equation. The speed and efficiency of the St. Mihiel operation suggested that American military capability had matured more rapidly than German intelligence had predicted. Intelligence reports indicated that German morale was suffering from the psychological impact of American success. Prisoners interrogated by American intelligence officers expressed surprise at the effectiveness of American tactics and equipment. Many German soldiers had been told that American forces were poorly trained and equipped, making their rapid defeat particularly demoralizing for troops already strained by 4 years of combat. The success at St. Mihiel validated Pershing's insistence on maintaining American forces under unified American command, rather than dispersing them among French and British units. European Allied commanders had argued for integrating American troops into existing command structures, but Pershing had insisted that American forces fight as coherent national units. The St. Mihiel victory demonstrated that American military leadership had developed the capability to plan and execute major operations independently. Logistical achievements were as significant as tactical success. American supply services had managed to sustain 550,000 troops in combat operations while maintaining the complex infrastructure necessary for modern warfare. This demonstrated that American industrial capacity could support large-scale military operations overseas, a capability that would prove crucial in subsequent campaigns. As reports of American victory reached newspapers in the United States, public enthusiasm for the war effort reached new heights. The St. Mihiel operation provided concrete evidence that American sacrifice was producing meaningful results. Reinforcing popular support for continued military commitment in Europe, September 15th marked the official conclusion of the St. Mihiel offensive as American forces consolidated their positions and began the systematic occupation of captured territory. The rapid transformation from combat operations to administrative control revealed the complexity of modern military campaigns, which required not only the ability to defeat enemy forces, but also the capacity to govern and administer occupied territory. Military government units, hastily organized from re-echelon personnel and civilian specialists, began the enormous task of restoring civil administration to liberated French territory. 4 years of German occupation had disrupted normal governmental functions, leaving American administrators to improvise solutions for problems ranging from food distribution to postal services. These challenges provided valuable experience that would prove crucial during post-war occupation duties in Germany. Engineer units worked tirelessly to restore transportation infrastructure destroyed during the German withdrawal. Bridges had been systematically demolished, railway lines torn up, and roads cratered to deny their use to advancing Allied forces. American engineering capabilities, enhanced by civilian expertise drawn from construction industries, gradually restored communication and transportation networks that enabled the resumption of normal economic activity. The treatment of German prisoners presented both practical and ethical challenges. Over 16,000 captured soldiers required housing, feeding, and processing, according to international law governing prisoners of war. American military police, working with Red Cross representatives, established prisoner of war camps that met international standards while maintaining security necessary to prevent escape attempts. The humane treatment of captured Germans reflected American values and contributed to growing wariness among enemy forces. Intelligence officers conducted systematic interrogations of captured German personnel to assess enemy capabilities and intentions. These interviews revealed significant information about German troop dispositions, morale conditions, and strategic planning that would prove valuable in subsequent operations. The intelligence gathered at St. Mihiel contributed to American understanding of German military capabilities and helped refine tactical approaches for future campaigns. Colonel Marshall's operations staff began immediate planning for the next major American offensive in the Meuse-Argonne sector. The success at St. Mihiel had validated American tactical approaches and organizational capabilities, but Marshall recognized that future operations would face more determined German resistance. An element of surprise that had contributed to success at St. Mihiel would not be available in subsequent campaigns, requiring different tactical approaches and more extensive preparation. General Pershing used the victory to strengthen his position in disputes with Allied commanders over American strategic autonomy. French Marshal Ferdinand Foch and British Field Marshal Douglas Haig had argued for dispersing American forces among existing Allied armies. But Pershing had insisted on maintaining independent American command. The St. Mihiel victory demonstrated that American forces were capable of conducting major operations under American leadership, validating Pershing's strategic vision. The propaganda value of American success was not lost on either side. German newspapers attempted to minimize the significance of the defeat, characterizing it as a planned withdrawal rather than a military disaster. American and Allied newspapers celebrated the victory as evidence of growing Allied strength and declining German capabilities. The battle for public opinion was as important as tactical success in determining the war's ultimate outcome. Captured German equipment provided valuable intelligence about enemy manufacturing capabilities and technological development. American technical specialists examined artillery pieces, machine guns, and other military hardware to assess German industrial capacity and identify potential technological advantages. This technical intelligence contributed to American understanding of German military production and helped predict future enemy capabilities. The rapid success at St. Mihiel created logistical challenges for subsequent operations. Ammunition and supplies that had been allocated for extended fighting were not consumed. But transportation limitations made it difficult to redistribute these resources to other sectors where they might be needed. Supply officers worked to overcome these distribution problems while maintaining readiness for future operations. As the immediate excitement of victory subsided, military historians and tacticians began analyzing the campaign to extract lessons for future operations. The St. Mihiel offensive demonstrated the importance of thorough planning, effective coordination between different combat arms, and maintaining communication between advancing units and higher headquarters. These lessons would influence American tactical doctrine throughout the remainder of the war and beyond. The success also highlighted the growing effectiveness of American military training programs, which had transformed civilian volunteers into competent soldiers in remarkably short time periods. The echoes of the St. Mihiel offensive resonated far beyond the boundaries of the reclaimed French territory, marking a watershed moment in American military history and the broader trajectory of the Great War. As October arrived and American forces prepared for their next major test in the Meuse-Argonne, the lessons and implications of their first independent victory continued to shape strategic planning and national confidence. General Pershing's post-battle assessment revealed both the magnitude of American achievement and the challenges that lay ahead. In his confidential reports to Washington, Pershing acknowledged that German resistance at St. Mihiel had been lighter than anticipated due to their strategic withdrawal. But he also emphasized that American planning, logistics, and execution had functioned at a level that would have ensured success even against determined resistance. The operation had validated his insistence on thorough training and careful preparation as the foundation for American military effectiveness. The international diplomatic implications of American success extended far beyond military considerations. President Woodrow Wilson's vision of American leadership in post-war Reconstruction gained credibility through demonstrated military capability, who had initially regarded American forces as useful reinforcements rather than equal partners, began to recognize that American industrial capacity and military effectiveness would make the United States a dominant force in shaping the post-war world order. Military innovation during the Saint-Mihiel campaign influenced tactical development throughout the Allied armies. The effective coordination between infantry, artillery, tanks, and aircraft demonstrated the potential for combined arms operations that would characterize warfare for the remainder of the 20th century. Colonel Patton's tank operations, while small by later standards, provided valuable experience that informed American armored doctrine during the interwar period and World War II. The human stories that emerged from the campaign reflected the broader transformation of American society during the war. Soldiers who had grown up in isolated rural communities found themselves fighting alongside men from urban industrial centers, creating bonds that transcended regional and ethnic differences. The Rainbow Division's diverse composition, National Guard units from 48 states, symbolized the emergence of a truly national American identity, forged through shared military service. Medical advances developed during the campaign contributed to improved survival rates for wounded soldiers throughout the remainder of the war. Field hospitals established during the rapid advance pioneered triage procedures and evacuation techniques that saved thousands of lives in subsequent operations. American military medicine, initially dependent on French and British expertise, had developed indigenous capabilities that would influence civilian medical practice after the war. The economic impact of American military success reinforced domestic support for continued wartime production. Factory workers producing ammunition, uniforms, and equipment received tangible evidence that their efforts contributed to meaningful military achievements. This connection between industrial production and battlefield success sustained civilian morale during the final phase of American involvement in the conflict. Intelligence capabilities developed during the Saint-Mihiel operation established foundations for American intelligence services that would expand significantly during subsequent conflicts. The systematic interrogation of prisoners, analysis of captured documents, in coordination with Allied intelligence agencies provided experience that informed American intelligence doctrine throughout the 20th century. As referenced in historical documentation from the Library of Congress, the Saint-Mihiel victory represented the largest offensive operation ever undertaken by United States Armed Forces to that date, establishing precedents for American military planning and execution that would influence strategic thinking for generations. The successful coordination of multiple corps, supporting arms, and logistical systems demonstrated American capacity for large-scale military operations that would prove crucial during World War II. The symbolic significance of Saint-Mihiel extended beyond its immediate military importance. For the first time since the American Civil War, United States forces had achieved decisive victory in a major military campaign against a sophisticated enemy. This success validated American military institutions and leadership, while demonstrating that democratic societies could effectively organize for modern warfare without sacrificing fundamental political values. The town of Saint-Mihiel itself became a shrine to American military achievement, with monuments and cemeteries commemorating the soldiers who died reclaiming French territory from German occupation. These memorial sites served as reminders of American sacrifice, while symbolizing the nation's commitment to defending democratic principles against authoritarian threats. The legacy of Saint-Mihiel lived on in American military tradition, inspiring subsequent generations of soldiers who would face similar challenges in World War II, Korea, and beyond. The principles of thorough planning, effective training, and aggressive execution established during those 4 days in September 1918 became hallmarks of American military doctrine, proving their enduring value through decades of subsequent conflicts and establishing the foundation for American military effectiveness throughout the 20th century.